We're just watching faces flashing up here.
Yes.
Welcome, everybody.
Yeah, let's wait for another minute, I guess.
Okay. Looks like maybe, what do you think, Isul?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Joanne Bernardi. I'm a faculty member at the University of Rochester in the Japanese program of Modern Languages and Cultures. Welcome to tonight's event, #activism, a conversation with Moya Bailey. This is hosted by the Department of Modern Languages and Cultures at the University of Rochester and the Global Digital Humanities Working Group, which is sponsored by the Central New York Humanities Corridor through an award by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Since location is core to our identity in name and in practice, the Central New York Humanities Corridor acknowledges with respect that our 11 institution consortium spans the ancestral lands and waterways of the Haudenosaunee people. Corridor partnerships take place on lands of the nations of the sovereign Haudenosaunee Confederacy, founded at least 1,000 years ago at Onondaga Lake, Central New York, and it remains home to the Haudenosaunee. We acknowledge the ongoing history of dispossession across the Confederacy and are grateful to live, work, and share ideas on these lands. We're fortunate to have as our special guest tonight Professor Moya Bailey, feminist scholar, writer, activist, and assistant professor of Africana Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Northeastern University. She's currently the MLK visiting professor at MIT. Professor Bailey is a co-author of the book #activism, right here, Networks of Race and Gender Justice. Her work focuses on marginalized groups' use of digital media to promote social justice as acts of self-affirmation and health promotion. And she is interested in how race, gender, and sexuality are represented in media and medicine. Professor Bailey currently curates the #TransformDH Tumblr initiative in digital humanities, and she is also the digital alchemist for the Octavia E. Butler Legacy Network. Professor Bailey is joined in conversation with the Global DH Working Group co-founder, Professor Iskander Izul Zulkarnain, visiting assistant professor of media and society at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, who works on global digital cultures. The Global DH Working Group, which brings together faculty from Hamilton College, Hobart and William Smith Colleges, Syracuse University, and the University of Rochester, is a collaborative endeavor that applies the holistic global outlook of area studies methodologies to explore issues and debates central to digital humanities research and pedagogy. We invite critical conversation and reflection that can further broaden the parameters of digital humanities practice beyond those barriers of identity, class, race, gender, sexuality, disability, and language that divert the distribution of information and technologies. Tonight's public conversation is the first part of our working group's signature event series on the theme Digital Activism in and Outside the Classroom. It will be followed later this spring in March and April by a two-part virtual workshop that will provide junior scholars and advanced graduate students the opportunity to discuss their research and progress relevant to any aspect of digital media that intersects with social and environmental justice activism, both historically and in the present. This workshop will also be hosted virtually by the University of Rochester. And I believe that we are going to share, if we can, the call for participation in the chat. The deadline for submissions of a brief 300 to 400 word abstract proposal is this Monday, February 15th. So there's still some time to apply. And it's for current students and PhD graduates since 2017 working in any humanities or social sciences disciplines. And of course, you can always contact me or Izul, Harry Gu, Leah Schaefer, and June Huang. These are, looking at my little boxes here on the screen, these are the members of the DH Global Digital Humanities group. So without further ado, then I'll turn it over to Izul and Professor Bailey.
Thank you so much. Oh, Izul, I think you're on mute.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's one more little piece of logistical information that I forgot. We'd just like to ask everybody to please remain muted until the question and answer session. And if you could, to please wait until you're called up to ask a question. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Joanne. And so I will be acting as the interviewer here. So I'll be interviewing Professor Moya Bailey. And first of all, I would like to welcome Professor Moya Bailey. I'm very delighted to have you here with us to share your knowledge and expertise with us tonight on the theme, on the topic of hashtag activism. So I guess my first question here, it's not really a question, it's more like a, if you can share about your personal sort of like journey as a digital humanist scholars and how you perceive the field of digital humanities in the past and at the present, given your role in the hashtag Transform the Age Tumblr initiative. So I guess that's my sort of first question for you.
Thank you so much. And I want to say thank you again for having me. For those who don't know, this has been 3 years in the making. I think I got my first email from Azul in 2019. So yeah. It is really, I'm so glad that we were able to make this happen. I am joining you all from land that was tread as part of the Trail of Tears. And I want to acknowledge that because I do think that when we're doing this digital work, it can be hard sometimes to remember that we are still in this world of settler colonialism, even as we are in these virtual spaces, and that there is some real material reality that gets abstracted when we're talking to each other through screens. Mm-hmm. And that is sort of how I came into digital humanities. I definitely saw myself as a early adopter of a lot of different social media platforms in high school and then college. One story that my parents love to tell is that when I was in 6th grade, I said I wanted the internet for Christmas. I thought that I could just get it. And it was at that point that I started to really learn about and enjoy digital culture. So, you know, I participated in AOL chat rooms. I then graduated to building my own HTML website in high school and college to keep up with friends. I used Blogger, LiveJournal. So all of these early platforms that showed me that there was a real power in making connections with people online. And when I was in graduate school, I was still connected to a lot of people who were using those same platforms, but as an organizing tool.
Mm.
So I was connected to some radical women of color bloggers who had connections across their blogs, would read each other's work, would mobilize together when something was happening. And I saw that as very much separate and apart from what I was doing in grad school. I had also been pre med while I was in undergrad. And so the switch to graduate school really wanted, I was really compelled to think about how do structural inequities remain in medicine.
Mm.
And in that process, I started looking at the hidden curriculum, what's happening in medical education that is informing the way doctors are seeing patients. And I kept coming back to images and representation and how they were circulating for medical students at this moment where medical education gets institutionalized, and then how that connected to uh, some of the images that were circulating in this contemporary moment about Black women and other marginalized groups.
Mm.
And so I was thinking, what is it about representation that keeps coming up? Why is that such a salient issue?
Mm.
And there was also at that time a project by Mellon called VAT camps, and these were uh, specifically digital humanities unconferences where people were able to gather together and learn new digital humanities skills
Mm-hmm.
in this unconference environment. And so I found myself drawn to that given my own interest in women of color blogging. And then I was making these connections between, the online activism that I have been involved with also has real application in terms of the way these platforms can be studied or the way people can use other digital tools to advance their humanities research. So
Mm-hmm.
those things came together for me in a way that I hadn't quite considered. And for those of us who were graduate students at the time, one of the things we noticed was that there was still a little bit of a disconnect between the activism that people were doing and the scholarship that we were seeing in the digital humanities.
Mm-hmm.
So we wanted actually for there to be more of an opportunity for the digital humanities to dig more deeply and more critically into these questions of race, gender, sexuality that were embedded in digital humanities, but they just weren't being named.
Mm-hmm.
So we early conversations during that time involved this framing of digital humanities as, hacking versus yakking. And
Mm-hmm.
so those of us on the critical side were considered yackers, and those who were doing stuff and building things were the hackers. And so that division was a real tension at a point. There was a way that people felt it wasn't really digital humanities unless you were building something.
Mm-hmm.
And then for those of us who were yakking, we're like, well, we should be critical about what it is that we're building and what it is that we hope to accomplish. And so Transform DH emerged out of a set of graduate students and junior faculty who were really interested in that question. How do we bring issues of social justice to digital humanities, both through what we're studying and how we study?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Professor Bailey. That was so inspiring. And also, yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with that discourse of hacking and yakking in digital humanities. I mean, that's kind of like sort of like tension.
Yes.
Yeah, in a sense, yeah. So, yeah, thank you so much. And so my next question is perhaps a very general question, which is so in your book, hashtag activism, I'm just wondering what is your and the other two co-authors definition of hashtag activism? especially in your book, you frame it in relation to race and gender justice.
Yes, yes. I think we saw hashtag activism as people consciously using hashtags to advance social justice issues and concerns. So you can see hashtag activism occurring when people are talking about using a hashtag to incite some sort of action or to bring some awareness to a particular issue. So we looked at race and gender justice hashtags that had to do with questions of race and gender, and that were trying to address some of those things that were happening in popular culture that weren't already being addressed. And, you know, an example that I gave in perhaps the video that you watched, or an example from the book, actually comes from Jeannie Lauren, who wrote the foreword to the book, talking about how she witnessed one of the jurors from George Zimmerman's trial being put in a position to get a book deal. And for her, that just seemed, you know, how is this possible that this juror is going to be able to profit on their time on this jury? And Trayvon Martin, you know, has passed. Like, this just seems completely unfair and unjust. And so Jeannie, who did not consider herself an activist, was able to mobilize Twitter and hashtags to get the book deal rescinded. And so the editor of the book actually decided, well, this does not seem to be worth it, and then was able to get that book deal rescinded. So for me, that's such a powerful example of the power of hashtag activism in the real world. You know, it can actually have material consequences. And for us, looking at the way people used hashtags was uh, a reminder that the digital tools and the digital platforms that sometimes we take for granted can be repurposed and reimagined for these social justice ends. And of course, that isn't a perfect process. And one of the things we talk about is whether or not some of those hashtags were ultimately successful for whom and on what terms, but just that there is this potential and that people are going to find possibilities even where we perhaps don't think there are any. And, you know, what I really like about it is that these platforms, perhaps in their design and in their initial entry into the marketplace, were never considering that these tools could be repurposed and refashioned in these ways. But because of human ingenuity, people were able to remake them in ways that were meaningful to them and were able to promote the causes that they believed in.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's really poignant and also a very clear answer for because we have sort of kind of like a general assumption of hashtag activism as a kind of like a slacktivism or activism for slackers. So your answer is really shows like how it's sort of about repurposing of technology. It's kind of like an unintended consequence of how humans use technology. So I really like that kind of framing.
Oh, yeah, thank you. And I will add too that one of the things we hope to do in creating the book was to get away from that assumption that people have that hashtag activism is slacktivism. And something we didn't attend to in the book very much, but definitely something that we're still considering and work that I do dovetails with is questions of ability and access. So, how are we thinking about these platforms enabling disability activism that might be more difficult to do IRL with people who have different mobility challenges and ways of trying to get access to the world? the internet can be its own access for people who are otherwise homebound. So it has definitely been a critical tool for the organizing of the disability justice movement. And I've been really just impressed and blown away by the kind of activism that disability justice organizers have been able to do online. One example of this is Alice Wong's work, and Alice has been part of a project called Crypto Vote, and making sure that all of the candidates are thinking about and addressing disability justice issues in their platforms, and did some of these first ever Twitter talkbacks with candidates using this hashtag CryptoVote, and making sure that candidates are addressing these issues. And currently, when there was this change in California about who would get access to the coronavirus vaccine, Alice was able to start the hashtag high risk CA, high risk California, and bring real awareness to what it means that California has moved away from a plan for distributing the vaccine that prioritized people who were high risk to a plan that was only designed around age. And so that really opened the door for a conversation about what has been happening for disabled people during this pandemic, who have been unfortunately uh, even more restricted in their movements as they try to survive and stay well in the context of COVID.
Right. Yes. Yeah, that is really true, in terms of like how um, we tend to think of from the kind of like ableist perspective about the use of technology. Well, it may be really crucial for those who are immobile, or who have like a certain barrier uh, in terms of like space or like mobility. So yeah, that's really good. And so my two of my next question would be specific about your book. And I've used your books in my class, so and the students really find it uh, um, really engaging, and they really like your material. So,
Oh, good.
and so this is about one of the chapters. This is about the chapter that discusses about the shifts in the visibility of racial justice movement in the U.S. Via hashtag activism, such as the Black Lives Matter movement. So you and the two co-authors have examined this the birth of quote unquote celebrity activists in hashtag activism, such as Sean King and Dirai Makasan, and the controversy around these figures. So can you revisit this topic, especially in terms of the perception of hashtag activism as a leaderless or a quote unquote leaderful form of digital activism?
Oh, yes, that's a great question. I do think that something that humans do, for good or for ill, is try to decide who is the leader, who's at the forefront.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some people who are very comfortable with being pushed into that position, or being promoted to, understood to be in that role.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't actually reflect what's happening on the ground and who's really doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there is something about seeing the same person over and over again that works well for media sound bites, right? So it's easy to go to D-Ray, it's easy to go to Sean King,
Mm-hmm.
because they have a consistent presence. And I mean, to think of D-Ray specifically, did such a good job with his own branding with his blue vest.
Mm-hmm.
You have a very clear picture of who this person is, and that memory stays with people. And
Mm-hmm.
it becomes harder, I think, to deal with the fact that there are different people who are moving up and moving back depending on what's needed and depending on their own capacity. So
Right.
one thing that we did see, and comes out in the text a little bit, but there was a lot of trauma experienced by the people who were on the front lines and doing some of this early organizing, that
Mhm.
in some ways demanded that they take some time away and move back and not be as public. But for people who are primarily or using the digital platform as one of their main ways of organizing, perhaps aren't on the ground in Ferguson consistently, aren't
Mhm.
from that community, there's a way that they can use Twitter to promote and leverage their own visibility, sometimes at the expense of what is happening on the ground. So
Mhm.
that is something that can occur. But I do think that one of the challenges is to think about, why do we have that impetus to put certain people in the front,
Mhm.
and what would it look like for us to have a more decentralized idea of who is in this leaderful movement. And one of the ways we tried to do that or address that is by having as many voices as we could bring into the text, as many handles that we could represent just this real growth and diversity of voices who were part of making Ferguson and other Black Lives Matter movement work and actions visible.
Mhm.
And to do that ethically, we also employed a strategy of actually reaching out to every single handle that is mentioned in the text, just
Mhm.
to say, we are going to be using this quote in this book. Would you like to be de-identified? How do you feel about that? And we got some really wonderful responses. And we also took the position, if somebody had um, deleted their account, we just didn't use their Twitter data, because that to us seemed to be a signal that they did not want to be included. So
Mhm.
there was some data that we collected before somebody might have deplatformed, and then we just didn't use that data. So in trying to do this ethically and bring as many voices to the fore, we still didn't want to cause undue harm or stress to
Mhm.
people by aggregating their comments in a book that we hoped would be read by a lot of people. And this is something that we learned from the people we interviewed and worked with. A lot of the people that I've worked with in my different DH projects have been exploited by different magazines or academics.
Mhm.
I'm thinking particularly about BuzzFeed being one of those platforms that for a long time would just, collect what they saw on Twitter and throw it up into a listicle or
Right.
into a post, not really thinking about what it meant to aggregate all those tweets and to put all of those different people together under a particular conversation that people were having on Twitter. So, yes, it was public, but it's a very different thing to have all of that information collected and put in one place. So, we really wanted to err on the side of caution and make sure that we were doing what we could to prevent those kinds of uh, missteps from happening.
Mhm. Yeah, I do agree with you. I think we should really be careful in terms of like uh, aggregating or like collecting data, especially from social media platforms, when we're sort of like assuming that they're all public or they're all free and we can just grab it and then use it for our research. So that's a really I think careful, but that is a it's a really ethical thing to do. And I think I would also like to comment on the one that the sort of like celebrity activists, because I think you mentioned in the chapter that most of them are men, while the kind of like the on the ground sort of activists are also mostly women. So there's that kind of like discrepancy in terms of like attention from the public between like a gender kind of attention, gender-based attention from the public within this hashtag activism as well. So I'm going to refrain from my second question because I'm already up with my half an hour. So I'm going to open the floor for public Q&A from the audience. So we will have 20 minutes Q&A from the audience. And I would like to start with the students first. So please, students, if you have any questions, raise your hand or just raise your hand. I think we have Harry who will sort of like scrolling on the Zoom screen looking for the students. So if you have any question, raise your hand and then unmute yourself, turn on your camera, and then ask Professor Bailey your question. Okay. I think we have one. In Dashiell.
Yes. Should I go now or? So my question is kind of have you seen much activism, or has the activism of this of the subject of neurodiversity or on the subject of maybe dyslexia? Have you seen much of that, and is that unique by any chance? That's just a subject that I'm really interested in, so I was just curious.
Yes, definitely. It's actually the case that a lot of the people who I see leading this conversation are neurodiverse and disabled activists who are pushing a conversation to consider what happens in platform design that doesn't actually attend to the needs of people across a neurodiverse spectrum. So I do think that people are thinking about this not just in terms of their own needs that get forwarded through digital activism, but also questions about how these digital tools might be better structured to serve more people and a wider range of people a bit better. So some of the organizers that I think of is there's the Disability Justice Culture Club that's based in the Bay Area. They have a Facebook page and they have a lot of really interesting ways of trying to integrate conversations about the assumptions we make about people, like our assumptions of a neurotypical way of relating to digital media, and trying to reimagine what a disability justice culture could look like that doesn't assume anything about people's ways of relating to the world. So I think of that as a really wonderful example of the kind of organizing that can happen in that way.
Okay, thank you, Professor Bailey. And I hope that answered your question, Dashiell. Is there any other question from student? Yes, I think we have one more. I think it's Ran Andrews, and I can't really read.
Matthias.
Matthias, yes. Yeah.
So our question, we took a class about feminism, ethics, and knowledge, and we had like sort of a subtopic that was about how algorithms can be like really problematic. And so I was wondering, like, for like, I guess like asking for your perspective on how we can reconcile like using social media as a tool for activism when we know the way that algorithms function like on these platforms, and also how like censorship is used like as a tool for like controlling what like people can see and like what content is actually being able to like be shared.
Mm-hmm.
Great question. This is really at the crux of where my research is going and where I think a lot of these questions are going. So there's a whole conversation about the way that algorithms are designed by people who have certain biases that they haven't considered, and how the data used to design and build these algorithms has those particular biases as well. So thinking about, we mentioned this, I think, before you all got into the room, but we were talking a bit about Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology. And in that text, she talks specifically about the algorithm and the data used to create the automatic sensors for soap dispensers and turning on water, and how those do not recognize uh, the hands of people of color very often. That makes it difficult for the machine to read that there is a person there. And that is one example of the kind of algorithmic bias that needs to be addressed at the level of who are actually making these algorithms, how are they being trained to think about them, what data are they inputting into the system that is then used to test and to evaluate how a particular algorithm works. There needs to be a real attention to that. And so, one organization that is trying to address this has a wonderful title, the Algorithmic Justice League, which definitely makes me think of superheroes that are coming to save the day and get us to think about algorithms in a new way. And their work is really designed to address this at a policy level and also at a curricular level. What kind of courses might we need in computer science and engineering so that the students who are then going on to these tech jobs have the sort of insights so that they don't reproduce these biases that they hadn't considered before. So I am really excited about what is possible if we begin to look at these questions a bit earlier on in the life cycle of how algorithms are developed at the level of education and at the level of policy, so that we can interrupt in that particular script and give people some alternatives. And another example that your question makes me think of is what happened recently at Google with the firing of Timnit, who is a Black woman Googler who had done some really important work thinking about the huge energy costs of doing Google searches and of what the environmental costs are of these algorithms. How much does that end up impacting our planet? And Google deciding, we actually don't want you to tell that story. So there is this question too of, even when you have people introduced into those spaces who have the ability to perhaps question some of these deeply embedded social injustices that are prevalent, they can be pushed out or even fired for raising their voice around the way we need to reevaluate how we're working. So I'm really curious to see what happens as that moves forward, and what Google is going to do in response, because there has been a lot of backlash as a result of her being fired.
Thank you, Ren and Matthias. I know, great question and also great answer, Professor Bailey. So we have another question from student. Any other question from student? Yes, I think we have Emma Kurtz. Yes, Emma.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can.
Okay. How can we show that like our activism isn't performative? Because I know that's a big thing today, where like I want people to genuinely think like what I'm doing is real, but there's a lot of like talk about the differences between like performative activism and not. So how can you like, I don't know, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, great question. One of the things we talk about in the book is performative allyship, this idea of people just creating hashtags or doing things that don't move the needle in any particular way, but they do give the people who post about it some feeling that they've done a good thing. And one of the ways that we can differentiate performative allyship from actual solidarity, from being an accomplice, is the language that some people use. Uh, the way that you distinguish that is how the act is generated, who is actually directing what it is that should be happening. And for us, and what we saw in the text, the most successful forms of solidarity were those that followed the lead of the people who were most marginalized. So, doing what it is that the people who are most marginalized really wanted and really felt they needed was way more helpful than something that a well meaning ally decided to do on their own. That is not necessarily how you build solidarity. You do the thing that's uncomfortable, or you do the thing that you're being asked to do, not the thing that for you might feel good. So there's definitely a requirement for solidarity to listen to the people who are most affected. And that is where we actually saw some of the most impressive forms of solidarity in the text. And one example that I'll give that I gave in the video that you might have seen was what happened with uh, Elon White and the empty chair. So there was a cover that was used to illustrate the story of the survivors of Bill Cosby. And on that cover, there were photos of different women who had accused Bill Cosby of sexually assaulting them. And then at the end of the rows of chairs, there was one empty chair to represent the different women who perhaps couldn't come forward, couldn't share their story. And that image and that idea of the empty chair became a hashtag used by comedian actor Elon White to bring attention to the fact that there were these other women out there. And what he did was open up his messages on Twitter so that women could, and other survivors could tell their story by sending him a message, and he would post it anonymously. So it allowed people who, for whatever reason, felt like they couldn't say what had happened to them with their name attached, with their Twitter handle attached. They were able to go through this conduit and share their story and create a larger conversation about just how massive the issue of sexual assault is. And that was a form of allyship that really was directed by the people who came forward and felt comfortable sharing their stories. And it was something that he did as a result of the questions that, you know, this empty chair raised for the people who looked at the cover of that magazine.
Yes, I think we have a question from Jonathan Garcia.
Yes. Shall I read it? Okay. What is currently motivating you, and what do I look forward to? I'd say what's currently motivating me is the way that new platforms create new types of ingenuity and new ways that people are engaging. I think what's happening on TikTok is really interesting, and the kinds of ways that people have been able to leverage that for activism has been really impressive to me. And memes in general, everything can be memed, and you can really create some things that have such a wonderful critique and way of getting at things that we're all experiencing, but condensed and done so uh, adroitly and neatly in such a tiny little package. I love that as a medium for addressing some of the issues that are happening, and seeing even our Congress people kind of take this on and using new platforms. Thinking about AOC and her Twitch conversations that she's been doing, that to me is just such a wonderful example of people trying to meet people where they are and understanding that there are more ways to engage with your constituents than just the telephone and mail. And it's reaching a different, not just a different generation, but even a whole another body of constituents who maybe had been overlooked as part of the democratic process before.
Yeah, my students like to talk about TikTok activism a lot. Yeah, so I guess we have time for two questions from faculty, and then we can have a very quick takeaway. Um, faculty, and any question from faculty? Harry, do you see any question, Harry?
Yeah, I have a question. So
Okay.
thank you for the conversation. And I've been always thinking about the question of ownership when it comes to hashtags, because very often, when you click on the hashtag thinking, it's going to be about that, right? But then it's actually about something else, or the polar opposite of the thing that you're expecting. And so you do see people at a very different ends of the political spectrum claiming ownership of the same hashtag. I've been trying to kind of thinking about this phenomenon, and I wonder what you think about that.
Yes, I'm really excited about the way hashtag flooding has been used successfully to drown out some of the negative hashtags that have existed. So I'm thinking about K-pop fans uh, using different hashtags to create a different kind of conversation in a very conservative hashtag space or in something that is really reactionary. And the one story that I am thinking of in the book, we talk about the hashtag Girls Like Us that Janet Mock really moved successfully as a hashtag for and by and about trans women. But before Girls Like Us was used in that way, there was actually a biopic that was supposed to come out starring Taylor Swift about Joni Mitchell. And the film was called Girls Like Us. And that hashtag did not ever trend, but there were a significant amount of tweets using that hashtag as the movie studio tried to generate buzz about this movie that initially, or that, finally did not end up coming out. And so for me, I'm always curious and interested in the way that hashtags can be repurposed and used in ways that they weren't intended. And I love that people can move things a bit further than they perhaps were even designed to go. That Girls Like Us, Janet Mott came up with that on her own. I mean, I'm sure she didn't know about the previous way that the hashtag was used, but it makes for a interesting story if you're looking at it statistically. You know, what is all of this data that is related to this film that ultimately never appeared, and then two, what can we perhaps glean from those frictions and those tensions within a hashtag about who has the right to use it and how they are using it. So, also going to Girls Like Us, one of the things that we note in the text is that there were two conservative users of the hashtag who were prominent in terms of the number and volume of tweets that they tweeted, but were not prominent in terms of their interaction with the network. Because the network of people using the hashtag Girls Like Us were primarily left-leaning, you know, progressive folks, those two outlier users were essentially just ignored. So they saw their tweets, but just decided not to engage them. And I think that's a really important lesson to think about how people are organizing, not just based on identity, but on lines of affinity, that there is a shared political position by some people who are using the hashtags and they were able to cultivate that and keep that.
Yeah, I think you also mentioned with the stoker and the broker, right, in that hashtag contestation, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes. I guess we have one question from Taylor. Taylor, you want to unmute yourself and turn on your camera?
Hi, yeah, my question, I actually thought of it right before you said all of that, but it kind of ties really closely to all of that. I was thinking about over the summer how when you mentioned like how there were a bunch of different groups who were like manipulating hashtags, and I was thinking about how the fandom of like BTS over the summer had done that hashtag. It was either White Lives Matter or White Power or something, and I was just wondering what your like opinion was about that.
Yeah, like I think that's such a great use of Twitter, people really taking that conversation in a new direction. So that practice of Twitter flooding and just making sure that no, this is not how we're going to use that hashtag. We're going to use it in this other way, or prevent you from having a meaningful way of using this hashtag is an important strategy. And again, this is a strategy that has developed over time. You know, when hashtags first started, this isn't how people were using it initially. So I'm just impressed yet again with people's resourcefulness and ability to come up with new ways of addressing what they see as, and rightfully so, as, you know, hate speech online.
Thank you, Professor Bailey. So now we have time for takeaways. So if anyone would like to share their main takeaways from our event tonight, please unmute yourself. Well, raise your hand first and then unmute yourself and turn on your camera.
Hello, my name is Jonathan, and I was before this meeting. I was reading online before about you and about the book the books you've written, and I guess I'm just inspired, really, and hopeful that we can like go against the things that put us and people who are marginalized and just communities in general to a position where we're not like this in the future. And yeah, it was just wonderful to meet you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah. So the idea of community building is really important, I think, in your work on hashtag activism, right, Professor Bailey?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyone would like to share their main takeaways? Yes, I think we have Taylor.
I'll just say that I really, really liked what you said about, of course I'm blanking now, the relationship with like this ownership of education. I loved that. That was so interesting.
Thank you.
We have another, I think, Professor Leah Schaefer.
Thanks so much. I just wanted to say that thinking about you starting out talking about the transformations of technology and the sort of building of your interest in the way that you're thinking about this in terms of change for the future, I think that's a really energizing way to think about the sort of thread of transformation from Tumblr to TikTok, and thinking about the ways that these things can move. And I think the kinds of things that Taylor and Jonathan are bringing up are sort of like can be ignited by that sort of idea of transformation. So I'm going to take that away. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Do you have another takeaways? Yes, I think Ran and Matthias.
Yeah, I think my key takeaway, because I'm a STEM major, I really like found it very interesting what you talked about, how like the curriculum, I think in computer science and generally like in the making or progress that we call like science, is very like racially and gender divided, and how like that's something that I feel like more people that are into science or thinking about science should also take into consideration, because it's like essentially just how our society works, and it's really like important and essential, and it's something that I really like have been learning, and I really appreciate to know that so many people like also like believe in that. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Ran and Matthias. So perhaps maybe we can have Professor Bailey to sort of like have a concluding remark about her work or her research. I know that you have a book coming out, or has it already come out?
I have a book coming out May 25th called Misogynoir Transformed, Black Women's Digital Resistance. You can find it at your local independent bookstore. And I am really excited to have spent this time with you all. And I want to say there's something really iterative about just seeing you, Professor Schaefer, doing this with your hands in terms of the transformation, because there is something that motion just reminds me of the palimpsest, which is something I come back to in my work a lot, like this idea that there are things that are underneath what we are experiencing now, that the past, future, and present are in this cyclical relationship, and it is not something that is neatly or easily encapsulated as something that's sedentary. One thing begets another thing. So I am excited for what else we will transform and create together.
Thank you, Professor Bailey. So before we give a round of applause for Professor Bailey, I just want to say something that Professor Bailey is the one who coined the term misogynoir. And then she said that she doesn't want to copyright it because she feels that she feels sort of like hesitant to copyright this term misogynoir. So with that, please give a round of applause for Professor Bailey. And thank you so much, Professor Bailey, for enlightening us with your knowledge and expertise on hashtag activism. And for the Global Digital Humanities Working Group members, please stay for a while after the event. Thank you so much again for joining us for our event tonight, and have a good night. everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Oh, hi, Christine.
Hi, Christine.
Hi, this was such a wonderful session. I'm so sorry that I don't have my camera on. I'm actually driving. I listened to the whole thing from the car.